Daidren Zipperer commits to Pitt. Hykeem goes elsewhere, and Pitt loses to Georgia Tech. How's that going to affect Pitt's recruiting or the vision of it heading in to the rest of the 23 cycle and, of course, into the 2024 cycle? We'll talk about here with my man John Garcia Jr. on this episode of Locked On Pitt.
You are Locked On Pitt, your daily podcast on the Pittsburgh Panthers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into the Locked On Pitt podcast. Everybody, as always, I'm your host, Nick Faribault. Today's episode of Locked On Pitt is brought to you by Upside. Download the free Upside app. Use promo code LOCKED to get $5 or more cash back on your first purchase of $10 or more. We're talking recruiting. We're talking that area, of course. Even though we're in football season, everyone's always recruiting for multiple years, and that's why I welcome in John Garcia Jr. John, welcome to the show as always, my friend.
Good to be on with you, Nick. Always good to check in, especially when it's ACC play, right? Things are picking up a little bit. It's getting a little bit more dramatic, so good time to check in.
It certainly always is good to check in. ACC play, Pitt got into that. Didn't end well for them, obviously, in the first week, but we'll get to that in a little bit. I want to go back to September. Yeah, it's October now, so we're in another month. I want to go back to September, and Pitt seemingly had its wide receiver class fall out. They didn't get Hykeem Williams. They did get Daidren Zipperer, so it's not all bad for Pitt, but Hykeem Williams did go to Florida State. This seemingly just kind of picked up more and more as his commitment got closer. Florida State, the Noles get the commitment. What are you hearing on that end? Pitt sounds like they're still in pursuit. How definitive is this commitment from Hykeem Williams to Florida State?
Yeah, it's a good way to frame it, Nick. Look, this is congruent with what we had heard going into it, right? A&M probably held the most buzz at the very end of the summer, followed by Florida State and Pittsburgh as the season kicked off, in particular that 4-0 start for the Seminoles. He was in attendance for that LSU game on a neutral field. At that point, we started to hear more buzz about Florida State, right? That offer seems different than it did 2 months ago, right? Mike Norvell and company, more stable, and a stabilized situation is obviously ideal when you're talking about a college football recruit making his decision. So we heard about the Florida State sort of late surge or trend, whatever you want to quantify it as, going into the decision. And it felt like Jimbo Fisher's old team or his new team was going to win out for this verbal commitment with Pitt as that next program of notice there over Alabama, Georgia, some of the others that were on the list, Miami as well, for Hykeem. So naturally he picks Florida State, somewhat expected that morning or that afternoon, I should say. And then after that point, that's where we're at, right? What is the visit plan? Previously, Hykeem had talked about making multiple trips following a verbal commitment. One was going to be to Florida State, so I think that one obviously is still in line, but there was talk about a Texas A&M trip and possibly some others. So that's where we're at. Is that still the plan for him, or could that have changed with this commitment to Mike Norvell and company? I think that's sort of where it is, but it kind of worked out for Pitt either way, right? Because we knew the next day Zipperer was on the clock, and the real, I guess, optical worst case scenario would have been if you struck out, right? If you missed on both of those Floridians, and it was not the case. So I do think there was some silver lining in the decision, and I think a good example of self-awareness for Pitt to not necessarily have moved on from Hykeem, because I think, like you said, that communication will continue with Coach Underwood and Hykeem's camp all the way through signing day, which all of a sudden is just over 2 months away, right? It's creeped up on us to a certain degree. So I think that communication will continue, but the self-awareness and, hey, let's not slow play or limp into this Zipperer recruitment, because this could be the final piece of the wide receiver class when all is said and done. So a good example of that, and a little bit of time management in between with this coaching staff able to win that recruitment despite being clearly all in for Hykeem Williams as well. I think it says a lot about Pitt. I think it also says a lot about Daidren himself in terms of making a mature decision and not, I guess, feeling salty about maybe not being number one on the board going into the end of September. So I think maturity and professionalism all around on this wide receiver front for Pitt. And as things stand right now, a really nice group. Obviously, if you could flip Hykeem Williams, it turns into something else. But as it currently stands, you're plenty satisfied with the future of that wide receiver room.
Yeah, and so the commitments for wide receiver for Taekwondo Underwood in his first class: Zion Fowler, Kenny Johnson, Lamar Seymore, and Daidren Zipperer. Now, Zipperer is the newest commit to that class, John. This is a Pitt receiving core that has been uncharacteristically struggling early this year. So these freshmen that are coming in next year, they have an opportunity to potentially play. Give me the profile on Daidren Zipperer. What's the type of player Pitt's getting? Does he profile as an early commit, that plays early on? Is he a polished guy, or is he a guy that maybe needs to develop more? What is Daidren Zipperer? What's the storybook on him?
Well, he's kind of a late riser in the recruiting process itself, right? His older brother was a blue chip recruit, a tight end who's now at Florida. So there was an expectation that Daidren will become that, but he didn't quite grow as early as Keon did. And he obviously never moved to tight end because he's still certainly a wide receiver prospect. So it took a little bit of time for him to hit his stride in recruiting, but I don't think it took away from his game. He was always this slender, kind of smooth and twitchy wide receiver who really made big plays down the football field. And he's doing it at Lakeland High School, which is cream of the crop in Central Florida. I mean, it doesn't get much more high profile, great competition that Lakeland is playing week in, week out. And heck, I mean, he's going against the number one corner in the country every day in practice in Cormani McLean. So not only on Friday nights is he facing good competition, but Sunday through Thursday, it's about as good as it gets nationally. Lakeland's got a bunch of defensive backs that are Power 5 and FBS caliber. So he's getting that work every single day. So we have seen in a short amount of time quite a bit of jump from Zipperer. I think last year he profiled as kind of a flashy, high ceiling downfield target, kind of a guy you got to test a defense with kind of guy, maybe a return specialist as well. But now as a senior, we're seeing more of a well-rounded game, right? He is polished up in short order to the point where I do think he could be a fairly competitive freshman wide receiver at Pittsburgh as early as next year. He's got the frame. He's going to fill out and add a little bit of weight, which is certainly the first order of business from a physical standpoint for him. But his ability to stretch the field and win at the catch point, win at the apex, and show some body awareness on top of it on a 6'2" frame has really come to fruition as a senior. He's got another great receiver on his high school roster, Tyler Williams, that maybe takes some pressure off of Daidren. So he's getting a little bit of single coverage looks, and he's taking advantage of it. I don't think Lakeland has lost a game thus far in 2022, and he's a big part of that offense. So I do think that he's got some of the chops to be able to come in and play early. And if he does fill out and polish up just a little bit more, kind of on that same progression that we've seen over the last 6 to 12 months, I think he could be kind of an in-between receiver. And what I mean by that is he's not this big physical boundary guy, right? He's not an Hykeem Williams. He's not a Lamar Seymore. You already got that on the commitment list, right? I mean, that is your boundary, big physical wideout. He's kind of tall enough, but not big enough to occupy that role. But at the same time, he's not this 5'10", 180-pound shifty guy either. He's in between. Think of a Tyler Boyd, just from a height, weight, kind of smooth standpoint. He's got some of that in his game at this point. Not as polished as Tyler coming out of high school, but he's on that track with still, half of his senior season to play. I do think he's got the opportunity to factor in here sooner rather than later because he's just a bit different than some of the other receivers that Pitt is bringing in.
And I do want to talk about those receivers. But first, folks, I want to talk to you guys about Upside. From cringing at the pump to getting an eye-popping check at your favorite restaurant, folks, inflation's hitting us all where it hurts. That's why you can start using Upside. Upside is an incredible app for anyone who buys gas, groceries, or dines out. With every purchase, you can earn cash back thanks to Upside. Folks, to get started, just download the free Upside app. Use the promo code LOCKED. That's the promo code LOCKED to get $5 or more cash back on your first purchase of $10 or more. All you have to do is claim an offer for whatever you're buying on Upside. Check in at the business, pay as usual with the credit or debit card, and folks, you will get paid. In comparison to credit card rewards or loyalty programs, you could earn 3 times more cash back with Upside. Again, that's the promo code LOCKED if you want to get $5 or more cash back on your first purchase of $10 or more. Download the free Upside app. Use that promo code LOCKED to get $5 or more cash back on your first purchase of $10 or more. That's $5 or more cash back on your first purchase of $10 or more using promo code LOCKED. All right, John. So you look now at this group. You have Kenny Johnson. You have Lamar Seymore. You have Zion Fowler. You have Daidren Zipperer. Zipperer, a little bit different. You have the route runner in Fowler.
Yep.
The real explosive athlete. You have Seymore, who's the big boundary physical guy who can win the contested catches. And then you look at Johnson, and he's kind of a little bit of a mix.
Mm-hmm.
When you look at this receiving group, what's the story of this receiving group, this class? What's the strength that you look at? They're all very big. They're all 6 foot or
that's where I was going to start. I think it kind of strikes you that these guys are not only, bigger wide receivers, but just long. It's great to be 6 foot, 6'1", 6'2", in Seymore and Zipperer's case, but you're also long on top of that. When you watch Fowler, I mean, when he catches the ball away from his body, you're like, I mean, maybe he should be a DB, right? Because you covet that length a little bit more on that side of the football. So I do think that there's a nice variance in skill set, yet there is a congruence in height and length. And I think, again, when we talk about the defensive game going that route where it's about can you throw that back shoulder or defend that back shoulder from a defensive back standpoint? Well, these are the kind of receivers that you're throwing those balls to, right? And I think that while the offense has become more balanced, I would say, in 2022, there's still that need to play the strengths. And I think when you talk about the type of accurate quarterback that Pitt is always going to covet, right? That accurate pocket passer, that's always going to be a foundational element of the offense, right? Throwing back shoulder, timing, anticipation, those deep dig routes that we saw early in this season, with success up the seams. And with these bigger receivers, now you can line them up all over the place, right? I think outside of Seymore, the other 3, you can line them in the slot. You can line them up next to each other in a bunch. I think they can do so many things. And Seymore is just so close to his ceiling as just that big physical, almost a tight end type of body to where, he provides his own style of mismatch, right? If he's going against a DB, he's just too big and strong, too polished, right? He's elite with the football in the air. These other guys now you create mismatches with, right? If you've got a linebacker on any of these other 3, they're too quick. They're too twitchy for them to deal with. And then again, when you get to the secondary prospects, the length, the ball skills, the awareness really just complements that great size of all of these guys, right? Again, all of them over 6'1", just something that is rare to see on a verbal commitment list at that position. You go to Ohio State, Alabama, Georgia, wherever you want to go, you're not going to see that great congruence from a height and length standpoint. And all of them can win contested balls. All of them can win at the catch point. They all show some level of body awareness when the ball is in the air. So you're going to have a really nice group to come in and not only compete with the guys who are already on the roster, but with each other, right? Because now you're competing internally here to see, okay, which of these freshmen is going to be first to see the field. You can almost, Nick, make the argument for each of these 4, right? If you want to go ceiling, maybe it's Zipperer. You want to go floor, it's probably Seymore. And you want to go polish, you probably go Fowler. I mean, you can really start to make the argument for each one of these guys in their own right. So because of that, it's going to be tough to predetermine which one will see the field first, but you also don't have the problem to where you're like, man, these guys just need time to get there. If that was the case for 2 or 3 of the 4, you start to feel really worried about how the season has gone combined with what you got coming in at a really important position.
Yeah, a really critical position indeed. And let's flip over to that season because Pitt's season has been tumultuous, to say the least. I mean, this has been a team that's been bit badly by the injury bug, first of all. Just so many injuries, so many key players. But that's no excuse to lose to a Georgia Tech team that just fired its coach. And that's what happened last week. We've seen Keaton Slovis have moments of brilliance, first half versus Tennessee. Then he gets concussed, misses a game, comes back, looks rusty, plays awful against Georgia Tech. We've seen the receivers not really live up to expectations outside of Jared Wayne. We have seen a run-first offense this year. It's been very different from the Mark Whipple. Right? Yeah, it's a different offense from Mark Whipple, Kenny Pickett, Jordan Addison, all those guys. And I'm not certain it's what they want to do. I'm not certain that they want to run the football 40 times a game, but they almost feel like they have to. How can a season like this, a start to the season, when you have a debilitating loss like that, that is not a good look for a team that was in the top 25 to lose to Georgia Tech in the fashion that they did. How's that going to affect Pitt's momentum on the recruiting trail?
Look, any one game doesn't stunt you when things are fairly stable. So for Pat Narduzzi and Pitt in general, one game's not going to do it. Again, optically and in the moment, oh my gosh, awful, right? I mean, just nobody saw it coming. I don't know if Georgia Tech's players saw it coming. And certainly, look, the effort and all of that, they were galvanized, right? Look, when you move on from a coach, it galvanizes that roster because now everybody's playing, coaching, recruiting for their jobs. Everybody, right? Nobody is quote unquote safe. So you do get that increased effort, which sometimes is almost the reasoning that you see these things happen. So this has happened in the past, but on the Pitt side of it, you really can't quantify it so negatively off of one game. Now, if this becomes a trend and now we are not sure what Pitt has become and it becomes a polarizing season and an extreme season relative to last year, then I think you could see some impacts, right? Because other schools will start calling these recruits and be like, hey, Pitt was a flash in the pan. This isn't who they are, right? It was a lucky year, a fluke, whatever you want to call it. That's what these other coaches will start to say. But in one game, you're not going to get that. Even though it looked as bad as it did, embarrassing, all those things, you're not going to get that off of one game unless this was a program that wasn't so stable, right? If, Florida State plays Georgia Tech week 1 and comes out that way, everyone's panicking, right? Because there's hot seat talk now, and it just changes the entire narrative and perception of the program. This, to me, though, at the Pitt front, profiled as a head-turning, kind of move, but nothing that should create any type of panic from a recruiting perspective. And I think you'll see that going forward. You don't expect decommitments. You don't expect Kenny Minchie to call Notre Dame and say, hey, well, is that spot still there? It's not a 1-to-1 ratio as much as we as adults and fans think that it is, right? The panic we almost create is almost never translated over onto recruits unless it has ramifications with the head coach and the coaching carousel and things like that. To that degree, sure, that's when you panic. Pitt is very far from that point. Again, unless this becomes a trend and now Pitt plays this way the rest of the season and the conversations start to pick up at that point, I do think you see a more direct impact with recruiting, but I don't think any one game is going to slow down the perception of Pitt football, even though it does feel so different than it did a year ago.
Yeah, it definitely feels different. But this could easily be a Western Michigan game. I mean, we don't really know. But what do you make of an offense that shifts drastically? New offensive coordinator, so you knew that was going to happen to a degree. Mm-hmm. But we are talking about Kenny Pickett throwing the ball 40 times a game to Israel Abanikanda running the ball 30 times a game. I mean, that is as drastic a shift as you can. And no disrespect to Abanikanda, he's phenomenal. But that has been a shift. This offense has not been what it was last year. It's a different style. You probably know a little bit about the Frank Cignetti offense, and you've seen it. He's been around forever. He's in the NFL. He's been around the barnyard, to say the least. This doesn't necessarily profile as a Frank Cignetti offense completely. What does the recruiting class in 23 to you? If you look at it overall, you look at Kenny Minchie, the 4 receivers, the fact they only have 1 running back in that class, does it signal to you that they're looking to go run first? To me, with a guy like Kenny Minchie as well, it signals to me that they want to throw the football a little bit more.
I think 2 things, Nick. One, look, when you bring in a new OC and a new offense, it's a total reset, right? Forget the personnel, which is it's a reset in and of itself at Pitt this year. Forget the personnel. Even if this was Kenny Pickett and Jordan Addison and all those guys, you're still resetting the entire playbook, the terminology, the scheme, the timing, the tempo, even your cadence as a quarterback before you receive the ball is different relative to the system. So it's a total overhaul in that regard. So I think on one end, you're like, wow, that West Virginia game was amazing that it looked so good for it being game one under this new system. But I think the growing pains thereafter should have been somewhat expected. And I think when it comes to that shift, I think the personnel actually is partially to blame, right? You mentioned the up and down feel for Kedon Slovis really since that Tennessee game. I think that helped you dictate what you had to be from a play calling perspective and a conservative perspective thereafter. And maybe even during that Georgia Tech game, because he was back and rusty and you kind of didn't know, right? It felt like there was an uncertainty there, to say the least. So you have to naturally go a little bit more conservative. And now your personnel doesn't quite fit that, right? You don't fit a balanced run first type of offense. You are built to be more of a pass first offense. And like you said, the way that Pitt has continued to recruit, I do think signals that the balance is going to shift a little bit more towards a pass first offense, but all of that had to be implemented. So I think it's really easy to lump into the negative in year one, but as long as it gets corrected, and look, bye weeks are coming. There are times to naturally take a step back and self-evaluate. If there's a change in those small waves coming out of those kind of weeks, I think you could start to feel like, okay, this thing's going to get back on track, and it'll be more 60-40 in favor of the pass come at the end of this season, bowl season, and into next spring. But if that doesn't happen, I think that's where you start to see a little bit more of a drastic desire to change, right? And that's where it falls on Narduzzi. You know, it's not easy, but that's what he signed up for as kind of the CEO of Pitt football, and that's something he'll have to evaluate. So again, just like the Georgia Tech game in a phone booth, if that is what Pitt becomes, things have to change. But if it is not, and that was the fluke, then all of a sudden I think things will feel a lot better. But again, I don't expect a major recruiting fallout unless it's one extreme or the other.
One last thing, John, before we go here. You look at Pitt's schedule the rest of the way. Not hard. It's really not a hard schedule.
Gotta love the coastal, baby.
That's a good thing for them because, listen, it could help their record, of course, and if they get back on track. It's also, though, potentially bad because they don't have a Clemson like they did last year where they could have recruits come in and see everything. Now, they have Syracuse, which is all good and well with Syracuse trending up this year. True. But how much is that lack of a marquee matchup for them to say, we're going to stamp this one. This is where all of our recruits are going to come in during the ACC play. They're going to see the place rocking and everything. How's that going to affect them coming in to ACC play? Because it feels like their two biggest games were West Virginia and Tennessee, and everyone that's been big that they've wanted to visit has already visited.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a good point. And again, that's a mark of self-awareness, right? You look at your schedule and say, what really is the upside from a recruiting perspective? Always big early in the season anyway. So to have those marquee matchups at home and those games each live up to the hype, I think that's an important factor as well. I think that was advantageous for Pitt football. And that's why we feel like this recruiting class is getting closer to being wrapped up kind of all together, right? So I do think that's a big part of it. And I think when you start to turn the page to 2024, kids are going to want to visit, period. The games, the opponent matters if it's going to be, Penn State whiteout or a huge, Michigan, Ohio State, Alabama, Auburn. If it's a huge rivalry game, kids are going to come out and want to take a spot, and you might have a hard time saying no. But otherwise, kids are going to take huge visits. I think Alabama played ULM or something like that, and they had like 3 5-stars visiting. I mean, it's about how the school wants to recruit, because you can spin that in recruiting and say, hey, I know it's just Syracuse coming to town, but they're actually a really good team in the ACC, but we also want to be able to have less kids on campus to spend more time with you, right? So I think it really boils down to the relationships that these recruits have with these positional coaches, because they're going to want to get them on campus, period, especially local and especially underclassmen, 2024, 2025. you want to get those kids on campus as much as possible, period, even if the atmosphere isn't going to be on that top tier like it was for Tennessee and West Virginia. You still want to get that face time with those kids because you could only see so many kids when you're out on the road recruiting. And obviously for 2023, there's only so many you're going to visit within homes when we get a little bit closer to signing day. So you still want to use those game days as recruiting grounds to get face time and further a message with a recruit, even without those marquee matchups. And oftentimes, if the kids feel that love, as they say, they're going to make the trip almost regardless of opponent.
All right, John, great stuff as always. Tell them where they could follow you, read your stuff as always.
Yeah, real simple, si.com/college. We just put out our October class rankings. Pitt is number 23 in that ranking, by the way. So still all well on the recruiting front overall. So check that out for free at si.com/college. And I'm on Twitter as well, John Garcia _JR.
Folks, make sure to check all of that out. As we end it here, as always, hail to Pitt.